last year during lockdown, I undertook a sort of a daily practice inspired by a story called Old Kitna, which comes from Siberia, and it's about an old woman who goes out and has to walk 101 days to look for her daughter. And it's on that 101st day, her daughter's run off. It turns out she's turned into a wolf, and she's run off with this pack of wolves. But this old woman goes out into the snow, onto the ice to look for her lost daughter, and she has to walk for 100 days. And then on the 101st day, she herself turns into a wolf and then runs with the wolves and finds her daughter.
Welcome to Storytelling Insights, art, science, and great conversations with storytelling insights from researchers, artists, teachers, and many more. Welcome, Serena Constance. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation, exploring the art and science of storytelling. And I'm just delighted to have you because your work is fascinating. And I'd like to invite you to maybe share a little bit more about what you do and why storytelling.
Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak today, Kelvin. And I guess I've always been a storyteller. When I look back, even from a child, I was telling stories to my toys, my teddy bear. I'd line them all up. I'd tell them stories. A lot of children grow up with fairy tales and folk tales and myths. But I was often writing stories as a child, and I still have copies of, these old notebooks full of, sort of scrawling 7-year-old writing. So, and I think through my career professionally, I work with storytelling, but I'm really here today to talk about how I work creatively with stories in my own creative practice outside of work. And I'm an historian, really. My undergraduate degree was a history degree years and years ago, and I think I've always maintained that love of history. And I feel the way my practice is developing is working with family history. So I'm a family historian. I've been building on work that my brother had done for many years, and I've just taken it that much further. My own grandmother was the story keeper for our family, and she was always telling stories of our family members. And my brother made this brilliant recording of my grandmother speaking in the 1970s, just talking for about 2 hours of all her family, who were my ancestors, my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, and so forth. So what I've been doing in recent years is then with digital technology, I've been able to, with Ancestry.com, Ancestry.co.uk, etc. It's so easy to be able to trace your family tree even more because all this data is available. All the records are now being uploaded. So we've now got this massive family tree, and all these stories are coming forward. And because I seem to have an intuitive knack to be able to find these stories, and then with sort of my grounding in sort of history research, I can take a name, I can get a date of birth, I can get some minimal information, and then doing the research around will start to build a story about that individual. And where it's taking me, it's really bringing the art of storytelling alive for my own family. And I think that's something that's been lost in our culture now, is that sort of knowledge of the ancestors and where they've come from and the hard lives that they've lived. And I'm talking about, I've been going down centuries, I've got back, well, as far as the Viking Age, in the Norman Vikings and William the Conqueror coming over to England, obviously, and then through to, sort of stories of people working the land, and stories of people, being imprisoned for theft because they're obviously so poor and starving. They've had to, steal a turnip from the fields in Dorset and then be sentenced to hard labor for that. Wow. So all these different periods of history are coming alive through the research into my own ancestral tree. And I know it's become much easier, and I know a lot of people are doing that now, but what I found, I've seemed to have a knack to then bring the stories to life because I do the additional research around what was happening at that time. And then I find myself going on pilgrimages to visit the places where they were born, the churches where they would have been baptized. And, because for centuries, life evolved around the church in the UK. And I live in Sussex on the beautiful South Downs, and we've got amazing ancient churches. And I've discovered this, I've got hundreds of Sussex ancestors, which I didn't know I had. And I've even found graves and headstones of my great-great-great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-great-grandmother. And they're still there from the 1700s. They're still there, they're standing. And there's something very powerful and empowering, I think, when you do this digging, and I would call it slow bucket work. It's you have to keep digging away. It's not something that you can just do overnight. You do a bit of research, you let it go for a bit, you come back to it. But the way that that's opened up history to me has been incredible. And then what I use the research that I find to start to then tell the stories and bring the sort of voices of my ancestors to life. And I'm particularly interested in the stories of the women, because that's often the hidden history, or the history that hasn't been told. So so I use the creative voice pieced together with the information that I gather.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So that's obviously a very painstaking piece of work. I mean, you're talking of lifelong work almost here, aren't you? Of constant investigation and then weaving a narrative so that, I understand a lot of your storytelling is about helping people to heal as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think this is what an area I'm interested in developing my practice further, because in doing my own family research and coming up against really difficult stories, I've got a grandmother ancestor who was incarcerated for the last 7 years of her life in Aberdeen, and Aberdeen Asylum, and it was then known as Aberdeen Lunatic Asylum. This is the early mid 1800s, and I've been sort of working out what was her story. Why was she admitted? And you can just sort of feel the pain. I do. I think I'm quite a sensitive. I would say I'm a highly sensitive person. So I sort of almost can feel this and what I call the ancestral pain, that this memory, this bone memory, I think carry with us. And these are sort of forgotten stories coming forward. So why was she at the end of her life? She died in her late 40s in the asylum. Why was she there? And I look at her history, and she'd had multiple child loss and baby loss in quick succession. And I know myself through my own story of baby loss and stillbirth, how painful that is. And okay, it was much more prevalent back in, before modern medicine, but it's still, actually today, baby loss is very much a thing, but it's become a bit sort of hidden. It's never talked about. So I, you find this story of a woman who's probably had, complete breakdown through the grief of this quick succession of loss of all her children. So that's me kind of putting together the evidence that I find with, well, okay, how would that relate to that person? Why would they be there? So, and then to start to write about it, and then you start to see, I found you start to see patterns emerging. Another ancestor story relates to my Cornish ancestors. Another woman who lost multiple children to cholera, one of the very first cholera outbreaks in the UK. And I was finding all that story was coming forward whilst we were in the first lockdown. So it's a reminder that our ancestors had to go through everything that we're going through today in many ways. And so how did they survive and how did they get through it? And they did survive, otherwise I wouldn't be here today.
That's incredible. Sorry to cut you. Yeah, no, there's a question just emerging is around, so there is this power of the story and the investigative work coupled the intergenerational stuff that's going on here coming out. Does it matter if the storyteller is telling their own generational story, or does that make it more powerful or more healing perhaps, or where's the power? I think
yes, certainly it feels like I'm healing. I'm doing healing on behalf of my own ancestors, but where I'm finding then I'm able to help others with their storytelling and their family history. And this is what I'm branching into, having had the experience myself, is then helping others. So, for example, I've got a friend who was adopted, and she's since made contact with her birth parents, and then through that connection, certainly with her birth father, he was then able to fill in her own sort of family tree to a certain extent, but then with the access to the record database and the way of research that I conduct, I've been able to fill in more of the gaps. And then we went on a physical pilgrimage to places where her ancestors lived and worked the land. And she said she felt this great, amazing sense of release. So there's something in this work, and it feels to be deep within us.
Yes. Yeah. And I also know you do some amazing work around mythology, and you've done some study around that as well. So you're very well studied in a lot of these really powerful ancestral areas, intergenerational areas. I mean, could you share a little bit more about that?
Yes. I recently completed a year's program with Martin Shaw, Dr. Martin Shaw, who is a leading mythologist and storyteller in the UK, and he runs the West Country School of Myth down in Devon on Dartmoor. And again, that was spread over a series of weekends, and he takes stories from around the world and the UK that he's been working with and tells them, and then he gets us to then start practicing the oral telling tradition. So that's how I've reconnected with that power of the oral storytelling. And there is something magical that can come into the room when the atmosphere is right and the story is almost, I would say that when the story claims you. Sometimes as a storyteller, the way I work, I don't tend to say, right, I'm going to go out and look for a story to tell. It's somehow the story will come to me. So, for example, last year during lockdown, I undertook a sort of a daily practice inspired by a story called Old Kitna. which comes from Siberia, and it's about an old woman who goes out and has to walk 101 days to look for her daughter. And it's on that 101st day, her daughter's run off. It turns out she's turned into a wolf, and she's run off with this pack of wolves. But this old woman goes out into the snow, onto the ice to look for her lost daughter, and she has to walk for 100 days. And then on the 101st day, she herself turns into a wolf and then runs with the wolves and finds her daughter. And Martin's telling of that story then inspired me to develop my own daily practice during that first lockdown last year of the pandemic, when we could only take, daily exercise. And I'm lucky, I live by the beach. So I just got inspired to do this daily walk for 101 days and see what happened and notice what happened. And it was a walk on the beach. And I would do it every morning without fail, whatever the weather, however I felt, that was my commitment to do this walk for 101 days. And magic happened. So many synchronicities, I met amazing people. I felt inspired. When you walk on the beach, it's quite a liminal space. You've got the shore, which is not solid. It's solid yet not solid, because we have a flint pebble beach here in Brighton and Hove. And you've got the changing weather, the sea, the sun rising, reflecting off the surface, and all the, it's just incredible. So I stuck to that. So that's an example of a practice that came out of a story told by a master storyteller, and that then accessed for me yet more stories. So on my walk, for some reason, I don't know, I think I've made notes on, I must go back to the notes, but for some reason the story of Sedna came to me. Now Sedna is it's a myth from the Inuit people in Greenland and what's now Canada. So how that myth came to me, I didn't set out I'm going to tell the story of Sedna. Somehow Sedna came to me, and then I worked with her and that story.
That's amazing.
So that's my, sorry.
So the stories are opening. This is another thing is really interesting is that kind of so one of the things we talk about in our mindful storytelling, me and my mindfulness teacher and friend Shamash, we create this mapper, as I mentioned to you earlier before we recorded. And when you zoom into a particular part, it's like it can unlock another part, and then when you zoom in, it keeps unlocking and unlocking. So it almost sounds like you're having like a fractal experience with the stories, where you were inspired to take these walks because of the this Siberian story of 101 days of walking, searching for a daughter. You go on a journey, and these stories, they start coming to you, and these names and everything, they literally just come to you. So it's not like you knew a name of an Inuit and you thought, oh, I wonder what she did. Like your imagination, it didn't work from that way. It literally was like a download of a story. Yeah, or I might get, might get a sort of an inspiration or a sort of a thought or a message, and then I'll go and do some research, and then the story will jump forward. And then what happened at the end of that 101 days, the practice evolved where I ended up doing an overnight, what they call an utasetta. Now, utasetta in the northern traditions, in the Scandinavian traditions, is an overnight sit on a barrow, on an ancient burial mound. And I worked out from this place where I would always end my walk on the beach. It's like a pier that sticks out, stone flint pier that sticks out into the sea. And I was I was doing ritual there every day, sort of making a little offering and reading poems to the sea and the birds, whatever.
anyway, I worked out I was in a direct alignment from this pier all the way up to a hill on the South Downs that has some barrows on the top of it. So then I took myself up there and was walking, and I felt then inspired to do this overnight sit. And by this time, I'd been walking for 3 months every day. And so we were in July, because I started this practice in April, and then we were here in July, and things had opened up a bit more. And I said, right, I'm going to do this barrow sit overnight. And it's literally sitting with the spirits of the land, the spirits of the barrow, and noticing what arises. So it's quite, but you have to set an intention, and you also have to really work with the spirit of what I call the spirit of the land, because I believe that everything has spirit, and the land has spirit. Inanimate objects have spirits because everything holds energy. So that makes sense. So there was I, a woman alone, sat on an ancient burial mound overlooking the South Downs all night on my own. So it was it was a 12-hour sit from 6 p.m. in the evening to 6 a.m. in the morning.
Wow.
And magic happened. I had all these weird synchronicities, and I had a lot of insight, and then a lot of inspiration for yet more stories to come forward. So you can see a sort of a pattern. When you pay attention to a story, it can unlock something in you, and then it may take you over a threshold and into, I think, a very deeply creative space. And that's where I think healing can take place.
Yeah, it sounds like the way I'm kind of imagining it in my mind is like the experience that you're sharing here, and also like the story itself is alive.
Yes,
the story
it is
alive.
Yes.
And it's its own sort of entity, almost using us rather than the other way around.
And I do think a lot of stories come out of the land. If you look, I like to work with local stories and local folk tales, and they're inspired, but I think they come out of the land. And okay, yes, some stories will travel across the world as people travel across the world. So as people travel across the world, they take their stories with them, and the myths and the folk tales. But I do think a lot of stories will feel to belong to a particular landscape because they've been born out of that landscape. And it's almost like the land is telling its story through the people living and working on it. And I think as we become industrialized and we've lost some of that deep connection with the wild, with our own landscape, we lose some of that magic. And I think that's what I learned on the School of Myth, was to how to really connect back with the magic of the land. But Martin's not the only storyteller working with the land. There's a writer and storyteller, Sharon Blackie, and I've worked with her over a couple of years, doing 2 of her courses 3 or 4 years ago now. But again, she works very much with, the view that stories come out of the land. That study, that work that I've done with these master storytellers has informed my own practice.
It's making me think about someone who I interviewed in this series, who owned an organization that he used to be an architect, and it's called Narrative Infrastructure, and he talks about the importance of the land and the stories remaining coupled to inform, because you mentioned industrialization and disconnect, and he says that it's very important that policymakers and town planners have this information so that the development of the land is not askew, you know. So that's really powerful.
Can I just pick up on that, because again, development of the land and the developers and how they impact people and communities, it's often development is driven by profit. And so, for example, I had to fight at the beginning of this year. I led a campaign. I live in a block of flats. We had 2 very large mobile phone companies through an agent apply to put 6 giant masts on top of our private home. And I was like, no way am I going to allow this to happen. So I stepped into my warrior spirit to fight this. And we're, fingers crossed, we won our case. With the council overturned the application. But I found what I was using, again, I was going back to story. I felt I was calling in my ancestors that I discovered had settled this immediate, land, had been early settlers in Brighton and Hove. I felt I was calling in on them. I live right opposite a war memorial. I was calling in the memory of the warriors that were remembered there, because this base station would overshadow this beautiful war memorial. And I was kind of calling on, stories of strength and resistance and that warrior spirit. So that, again, that's another example of how, if you're a leader or you're having to lead a campaign, you can draw on the power of story and of history and your own ancestral history to help you in whatever task or battle that you're facing.
Wow, that's a really powerful example right there of wielding a story for us as a source of power. Yeah. So again, the story again sounds like a really living, breathing thing. This might be a tricky question to answer because I see there's so much power here, but what would you say the secret sauce is for you in your use of stories? If you really, really had to say, the secret, real distill it down to an essence, what would you say the secret sauce is in the way you explore new stories in your life and work?
I would say it's being open. It's being open to whatever might come in front of you, and to pay attention to the small things, because often that's where the magic resides. People are so busy rushing around, and I remember during the pandemic, we were all locked down. A lot of people said, God, we're really almost glad of having some space and time to breathe and just to slow down. And I think I do a lot of walking, and I'm always noticing things on my walks, the small things. And it's those small things that often have got something to say.
Yeah. So
I think that's, and it's being open to that, and then being open to, when I was sat overnight on the Barrow, being open to almost transmuting. What stops us from doing things is fear. And for me as a woman alone, my biggest fear, it boiled down to, I'm afraid of the wild masculine. As a world, I'm feeling vulnerable. Is some wild man just going to come out and attack me? And I think every woman carries that, the fear of the masculine, when the masculine is, because women, we've been for centuries, suffered under the patriarchy, under male systems, and so I think that fear is always there. And so for me, it was being able to do a very simple act and sit with that fear, and then by actually sitting with it, I came through it, and it made me feel even stronger having done that. All that came out of the story. The story that I heard.
Story. So
Yeah.
where can we find this Siberian story? I mean, I'm sure viewers are going to now be going, I want to see that story.
Old Kintner. There is I have recorded my own version of Old Kintner and the Wolf on my YouTube storytelling
We'll put that in the
channel.
description then below so that people can see this story, which has to take credit for so much, obviously.
Well, for me, it was transformational. But I think a lot of people I know who work with story in this way, would say the same.
Yeah. So what I'm actually getting here is, apart from a really nice warm feeling, is stories that have real inspirational potential, and can inspire transformation. I'm really interested to hear a little bit more on how the stories are working to help people heal the intergenerational stuff. That's really, really powerful too. And the work that you're doing, it seems to be bringing a lot of these things to the fore. And of course, we hear I mean, let's face it, storytelling is such a popular word now, and there is films and Hollywood and Netflix and all this stuff. And then, of course, there is the Harry Potter book series and so on and so forth. But they really have the power to, yes, social change and instigate action. Yes, if you have a campaign, as you've already highlighted. But it sounds like this real power to inspire is also there. How do you see stories being used going forward in terms of how us as a human race use stories intentionally? Do you see any sort of opportunity that is not being harnessed properly in the way stories are being used or not used?
I think it's really interesting. I think coming back to my own personal experience, when hidden histories come forward, and they may be traumatic and difficult, and I know, I've uncovered, if you're white British, you're somewhere along the line, you're going to find stories of how your ancestors took part in building the British Empire, and that comes with all the trauma that our nation kind of wrought on other nations around the world. So what do I do? I would say, well, what can I do? I've uncovered a storyline now that I didn't know was there. It's almost, but then it's led me to read more about histories that haven't been taught, that I wasn't taught in school. I mean, the whole, everything that's come up with Black Lives Matter, for example, I've been reading a lot around now, the brutality of the slave trade in a way that I hadn't accessed that material before. And it's because I've been learning about my own, the generations back, but, sort of what people were doing at that time. And I think the more conscious we become about these difficult periods in our history, it's so important to be able to then know them and tell them and make sure they don't happen again. So again, I'll give you an example. So one of my great grandfathers, so many times back, mid 1800s, he was a sailor. I have a lot of sailors in my family tree, who were in the Navy. He was on the naval vessel, so it would have been a sailing ship back then. He wasn't a member of the crew, he'd already left, but it was the very same boat that had sailed to the Easter Islands and brought back the big Maui statue. When you go into the British Museum, the great statue, it represents in the Rapa Nui culture, is an ancestor. They stole that and brought it back to the British Museum. And that was the very same vessel that my own ancestor had sailed on for 4 years. It then makes it really immediate. And then when I go to the British Museum and I see that statue, I think that statue needs to go back home. Why is it here? It doesn't belong here.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So, and I know that's it, and that's a big debate at the moment. You know, all these artifacts that are in our museums and that have been stolen. You know,
Mm.
and there's a big debate as to, obviously you've got the communities and the lands that they were taken from,
Yeah.
wanting them back, but then there's the argument of these big museums, and it's great. I'd love to be able to go to the British Museum and see all these fantastic things, but there's a part of me that's saying they don't belong here. They're trapped. They need to go back, and that's coming back. This sense of the land. Things arise out of the land that gave birth to them, and some things can travel well and others don't. Yeah. So
Wow, that is such a rich. Yes, and I can see why you say that it's lifelong work and it's it's a bucket rather than just an overnight job, because the stories are helping to, it really is those fractals again. You go into one and it opens another, and you go into that one and then it opens another and another, and so on. So that's really, really, really powerful. Yeah, and you're also doing some amazing work this weekend as well, aren't you? With your
yes. So I'm on Sunday evening, which is the obviously Halloween or Samhain, the start of the Celtic year, and it's the time at this year where the veil is thin between worlds in these traditions, and it's a time where we honor and remember our ancestors. And I'm taking part in a women's circle, which is run by a collective called the Silver Spoon Collective. And they are honoring all the women and some men. It was men as well. About 15% of those murdered were men, but obviously predominantly women, in the witch hunts, the European witch hunts, but particularly both the English and the Scottish witch hunts of the 16th and 17th, right up to the early 18th centuries. I've taken part this project called the Memorial Spoon Project, where you apply for a spoon that's printed on a piece of fabric, and you get sent the name of a woman who was killed as a witch, murdered as a witch, and then you can embroider or decorate the spoon however way you want, but as long as you put her name on it. And it's part of this big installation that's opening on the 4th of January, running for the whole of January, in Lancaster, as a memorial to all these women that were killed and tortured, brutally tortured, as witches. And it's a way of honoring them and remembering them. And the two spoons that I've worked with, the two women that I've worked with, again, their stories are on my website. And again, it took me to a really deep place, and I was uncovering all the history around their stories. And what it's brought me back to is my own ancestral connections to those burning times, although a lot of women were hung, they weren't just burnt. And this summer I discovered I've got an ancestor grandmother. She might be an aunt, but certainly on my family line, who was murdered as a witch in 1597 in Scotland, in Aberdeenshire. And this is all, again, I feel like you step into a circle, and then all these it's like when you throw a stone into the water, you've got this ripple effect. And I feel like I've stepped into this circle of women working to honor all those that were killed as witches, and it's opened up this big ripple effect, and I've now got my own family story to work with.
Oh, before you go, I just want to say thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe to my channel. It means a lot more than you know, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Bye for now.